Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn how to better style components inside of CSS. Let's get started. Hey there everyone. In today's episode, we'll be focusing on three individual properties that we can change in CSS. With these properties, we'll be able to change these dull and boring looking boxes into something a lot more nice and modern looking. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into what we have for our setup today. So to begin, for our setup, what we'll do is set up a container for all the components that we'll place inside with the ID of container. For this container, we'll set it up as a flexbox with a row direction and a wrap, just in case we want to add multiple elements. Alongside that, we'll set the width to 80, but you guys can really mess around with the width and the margins to whatever you'd like. Alongside that, for our component, we'll place a header and an image inside. The component, which holds both the header and the image, will have a CSS rule of just a border to begin with, because what we'll actually transition to is styling with what we'll focus on today are the three primary things of borders, shadows, and CSS filters. So with this, we'll start off with a blank border, then we'll also add some margin and padding just to add some more white space and give the content a little bit of breathing space. And finally, just set a width for the images if you're sourcing them from somewhere, because if you don't, you might end up with a situation like this where they're a little too large for your project. So with that, let's go ahead and transition into focusing on the first of the three styles that we'll be learning today, which is borders. So when it comes down to it, we've actually already discussed borders in this series, and we've very slightly touched on the topic that I'll be touching on today in the context of borders. Now, when I'm talking about borders, what I'm really going to be discussing in today's episode will be border radius. With the adjustment of border radius, we can soften edges of boxes within our website in order to make things seem a little more inviting. Just the sharp corners work great with certain styles, but if you're using soft shadows and soft edges, the use of a rounded corner on a square can really make a difference when it comes to a design. So what we'll focus on today is not only learning how to utilize border radius, but also how to individually control each corner. So to begin, I'll go ahead and add the property of border radius to my component, and I'll add a semicolon so it doesn't bug out like so. But past that, what I'll do is go ahead and start with 10px. With a single input, what we'll find is that all of our corners will inherit that rounding of the corner. Now, for the rounding, we can actually approach this in multiple ways or use different metrics. So, for example, instead of 10px, I can also do 10%. What this does is it takes for account the height and the width of our item and creates a percentage-based curve for our corners. Alongside this, technically we can use other measurements, but usually to avoid messes, those two will probably be your best bet. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and try and individually control each corner with this. So in the case that you have something butting up against the bottom per se, or something butting up against the side, we can individually control one side of this project. So to begin, let's actually control two separate sides, and instead of the left and right sort of analogy or system, what we'll actually be controlling is the top and sides of the web element. So for example, if I did 10 pixels for one and then 2 pixels for another, you'll find that this corner and this corner aren't rounded. And the reason for this being is the fact that what we're doing is controlling the top portion, or the first input. The second input would follow our second variable, and then again we repeat with our first input and then our second input. So to actually individually control each corner, what we would do is add 4 variables. Technically you can do 3, but it will bug out in certain ways, meaning certain interpreters might just not take the input. But in our case, we'll go ahead and stick with 3. So what I'll do is 5 pixels, 15 pixels, and then 2 pixels. So with this, we can see our variation in the corners, but just to make things nice and pretty, what I'll do is set them to 10 as a general rule of hand to keep things consistent. So with that, let's go ahead and transition into shadows in CSS. So now transitioning into shadows, what we'll do is go ahead and go into our component, and here what we'll do, and I'll actually add it underneath our border and border radius so that we have those two next to each other. But I'll go ahead and introduce the property of box shadow. With box shadow, what we can do is go ahead and control the distance and a blur that kind of literally shadows outside of an element for us. So what I mean by this is essentially I get to set an X and a Y axis on which direction our shadow will be going. So what I'll do is go ahead and set a 2 pixel by 2 pixel shift from the left to the right and from top to the bottom. So we'll be pushing to the right and to the bottom, and as well as that, I don't want a solid shadow, so what I'll do is add a little bit of a blur. So that will be 4px. Box shadows can be a little confusing because they require all this input, but once you get used to using them, they're really easy to use. They kind of just become second nature. But to clarify, we have our x-axis, our y-axis, our blur, and then we'll follow that by the color of our shadow. Usually, I like to keep my shadows a little lighter because a harsh black shadow can be a little tacky nowadays. And usually, what you'll actually find is that certain developers will layer multiple shadows that are lighter which is a preference over just a dark shadow, because it layers better and renders in a better looking way than a single dark shadow does. But for today, we'll just focus on the single shadow. And with that, I'll go ahead and let's say hash 333 would be a sufficient color for us. Still a little too dark for me, so instead I'll go AAA. And this should brighten it up a bit, and what you'll find is that the shadow forms to the right end and the bottom of our box. So alongside this, what I'll do to adjust this is, and actually soften the look of this, is minimize the border that we have here, and also actually, let's see what happens if we eliminate our border. With this, we actually still have a visible shadow around the box, so we can tell that it's actually still a box. And if you want things to look as soft as possible, if you're going for that minimal look, if you're going for neomorphism, which is a hot trend right now, this is a great way to try and create that softer look. So, like I clarified earlier, we have X, Y, shadow, the blur. You can also control a variable for shadow distance, but that's really what this is, as well as controlling our color. And with this, you can do colored shadows. So let's say you have a blue background and you want a yellow shadow, it would end up actually showing really well. So shadows are a great thing to work with. You can get really creative with them. And with that, let's go ahead and transition into our final selector, well, not selector, final style, which will be CSS filters. Now for our final style, what we'll do is focus on the filter property for CSS. With this, I'll actually be moving to my component image because it really works best with images. You can do it with elements, but it gets kind of weird. Anyways, what we'll do is go ahead, and I actually copy-pasted a little tidbit of code, but just like most of the properties I share with you, it's really straightforward. All you have to do is enter in filter, and then we're going to have these different essentially like functions that allow for you to adjust with a variable how you'll filter or pre-process the image through the DOM. And with this, what we'll be able to do is adjust for different filters. It's pretty simple and straightforward. What I'll do real quickly is just run through the most common filters that you can find, and I'll actually show you how you can you just keep in mind you can actually stack these filters as well, but I wouldn't recommend that practice. But let's say you're in the case where you have a website and you have someone who's sending images in and you automatically want to style them. What you can do is go ahead and utilize things like, aside from blur, you can utilize a filter like grayscale. And with this, what we'll do is actually adjust at a percentage base. Now, what would grayscale do? Well, it really just converts the image to either black and white, only at 100%. So, like that, we can have only black and white images on a certain part of our website. Or we can just dull and desaturate the image as well in a similar fashion. Alongside the grayscale, we'll also find that we can control the contrast of an image. So if you have an image with really bright colors and want to really make it pop, again, here we'll use a percentage to raise the saturation or drop the saturation of our image. So back up to 100, we're at standard, and potentially we can oversaturate our images by going past 100%. Alongside that, we have hue rotation. So this one is a little odd, just because with hue rotation, we actually are thinking of a wheel in the same way that you really hexadecimal works. It's a giant wheel of colors. It is a literal wheel of colors. So if we rotated the hue 90 degrees, what it would do is essentially invert the colors in a way. So I'm going to go ahead and enter in DEG for degrees, and what you'll find is that the colors in the images inverted. This is exactly the same as an invert in a way. So to show you, what we'll do is go ahead and invert and place that as our property value. And now for the variable with the invert, what I'll do is go back to a percentage. Now you'll see that this actually was different from what our hue rotation was, and that's because technically we should have done a 180, but we went only halfway, which ended us up in the territory of turning the orange in the image to a green. So that is something that's really best learned if you play around with it and map things out. Write down the results. Treat it like a little scientific test. Just the recording and the analysis of how this works can be really useful, and just creating this little library of memory inside of your head so that you don't have to go to documentation or reference whenever you're messing with these filters. So what I'd really suggest is go to a guide on a long list of different filters that are available for this, and see how you can use them for a creative project. See how you can utilize them in a technical aspect. And with that, I've covered the 3 styles that we were going to touch on today. So hopefully you'll join us next week when we touch on responsive design through CSS. This specifically meaning adjusting for mobile phones tablets, and desktop. So until then, have a nice week.